actually probably most of you not watching don't know Amelia. Amelia is also known as Professor Amelia Hoover Green. She's a friend. We've been friends for almost 20 years. We've known each other. Yeah, we're getting old. And we went to college together.
That's a lot.
And then Amelia kept going to college for a very long time so that she could become a professor.
True.
And I, I think I explained to you, Amelia, back in the summer, I asked members of my congregation to kind of suggest topics for helpful conversations for this year that we've all been through. We've talked about how to deal with relationship issues while you're stuck at home quarantining with partners. We've talked about coping with anxiety related to coronavirus and also the election and everything else going on. We haven't done we've done more conversations so far kind of about the pandemic, but obviously the election is timely. They called it on Saturday for Joe Biden. And I'm going to have a couple more conversations this month about politics. I'm going to talk with Reverend Abby about being on the ground at the demonstrations in Philly later this month, which I'm excited about. And I was trying to think of who I could talk to about the election that wouldn't just be another person like me who watches CNN all the time and has all the same information as I do and could bring some perspective. So I thought of you. And maybe you could start just by telling us a little bit about yourself. What do you do professionally? Where do you work? What do you study?
Yeah. So I work at Drexel University here in Philly. I am a political scientist. I teach comparative politics. I research primarily human rights violations during armed conflict, which actually right now is a less stressful thing to research than American politics. And then I think, potentially relevantly at this moment, I'm also the associate dean in my college for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I have a lot of different hats. I actually just now this minute sent an email to a DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion listserv, wearing my political science hat. I was like, could we rethink this particular administrative process because
political science?
Because of research, because of the facts. It's really, I'm pretty interested in, I like non-traditional bureaucracies, so I'm super fascinated at how anyone from like an armed group to a sort of police station to a teachers union, how sort of ideas and behaviors get from the top to the bottom and vice versa.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that is what I study in the context of rebel groups and state militaries, and it is what I'm interested in a sort of bigger sense too. So I often bring that annoying knowledge to the table when I'm in like an admin meeting.
Yeah.
People love me. I don't know if you know this, but people love it when they're in meetings with me. And I'm like, let's talk about the research.
Let's talk about what happens in global conflict and how it's relevant to this tiny argument we're having around a conference table at Drexel with administrators. Yeah. Because it is relevant. Well, we're all humans in conflict and we behave in certain ways.
We really, really do. I think I think a thing that is relevant to say is that the big finding for me in my research is that violence is overdetermined is the word I would use, right? So there are so many things that can cause violence or, to take a step back from violence, polarization, that it's actually really surprising when we see restraint in the world. So I should say probably that because I'm a comparative politics person, my expertise in terms of teaching is not really with American politics per se, but sort of with placing American politics in some kind of broader perspective.
And that's actually part of what I was excited to talk with you about, because I think the vast, vast majority of Americans, when they look at our government and our political system and form opinions about it and complain about it and all the things we do, we don't do it with a global perspective in mind. I myself have been out of the country a handful of times. I could count on both hands. I've been out of the country longer than a week one time in my life, and I wouldn't count my 3 months living in Sweden in college as like an in-depth understanding of another political system. So
yeah.
We don't know what our options are sometimes, right? And we are only looking at what we've seen. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's right. And that's a comparative politics. Like, I never expected to have my particular field be quite so relevant.
Yeah.
To a moment in American politics, but here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. You had a thought?
I was just going to say, and here we are particularly today. I think Americans have a baseline expectation that elections are going to work, both in the sense that elections are going to run smoothly and in the sense that when the election is over and there hasn't been when the election is over and there's no substantive claims of fraud, that the next thing will happen, which is a concession, a transition, a sort of orderly handover of power. And, with right now, with more and more sort of Republican Party figures aligning with Donald Trump's refusal to concede, that is something that is more or less unprecedented in modern American politics, but it's certainly not unprecedented in comparative politics.
Yeah. Yeah.
So here I am.
You have experience that is relevant.
I do. I don't love it.
Yeah.
I don't love that I have this relevant experience, but here I
am. People are actually very interested in this, so I have already a question. From my high school English teacher, Laura Ebersol, who I feel like I still need to call Mrs. Ebersol. I'm gonna wait on that question until I think we get towards the end. Sorry, Ebs. We called her Ebs. And Susan, by the way, who's a member of my congregation, says, as your younger child gets older and you have siblings in the house, you will find yourself using your conflict resolution skills at home, she said.
Oh, believe me. We are really, we're already there. We're already there. The baby has extremely sharp fingernails, and the 4-year-old is not so good at walking away from the fingernails.
Oh no. Well, yeah. How come small animals always have giant, terrifying nails? I don't understand.
It's not that they're giant. It's that they're small.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, because then yeah.
He's got scalpels on the ends of his fingers, is what's going on.
That makes sense.
I don't know if you can. I got a scratch here. I got a scratch here. I got it. He's really interested in faces right now.
I will say the other day, for some reason, I had a scratch right here on my face that I didn't remember giving. Like, I didn't remember getting it. And I was like, what am I, an infant who needs mittens to sleep with? Like, who can't control their hands? What's going on?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Oh, yeah. No, it's a whole thing.
Well, before we get a little bit more in depth into what happened last week, I do always like asking people a little bit about kind of what drew them to what they do and why they do what they do.
Yeah.
How many years have you worked at Drexel? Did you work somewhere else, teach somewhere else before?
This is my 9th year at Drexel.
Wow.
It has, I know. I'm very shocked. It makes me feel old to say that, but I don't feel that old.
Yeah.
Oh, well. Whatever, I'll feel old soon. My feet hurt. Yeah, I've been at Drexel for 9 years. It was my first job out of grad school.
That's right.
Yeah, things were really, really, really different in 2011, 2012. Like, we thought the job market was tough, and a lot of my, graduate school colleagues were having to take postdocs and so on, and they were like, oh, I have to take a postdoc, and now it's like even harder than it's ever been.
Well, what made you decide that you wanted to go into this field?
It had been my sort of default setting since college. I took a minute after college like a 1 year minute. Because I was, I was pretty sure I wanted to do research, but I also was like, well, what if what I really want is to be a lawyer? And then after a couple of months, I was like, oh God, what if what I really want is to be a priest? So I really thought hard about these other potential paths. And
You're Episcopalian, by the way, for anyone who's wondering.
yes,
Not Catholic.
yes, correct.
Yes.
I'm an Episcopalian. By sort of birth and preference. So, I will say I will gladly put up with pop music in my worship to hear Lee speak.
You've had to do it once or twice.
It was so hard, but I made it. No, I grew up in a pretty high church tradition. I love, smells and bells and radically progressive theology, which is a combination that Episcopalians can give you.
Yeah.
Well,
why was your default setting political science to begin with, though?
Well, I mean, it hadn't always been. It was my major, and well, first of all, I went to college thinking that political science is what you do when you want to be in politics. Not true.
Right.
I mean, it's a good undergrad major for people who want to be in politics. But I had I had a couple of great mentors who sort of expressed their belief that I could be a good researcher. I have a parent my dad is a professor. Between my husband and me, we have 6 parents, and all of them are teachers or professors. So the idea of spending my life in a university was like not a reach. Part of my job now is kind of sitting with the fact that it was not a reach for me when it is a reach for so many people. Like, I have students who are so much smarter than I ever was, who are like, wait, I could go to graduate school? Yeah.
And was your
should.
thought about being in politics potentially part of the generational call that we all heard who watched The West Wing in high school too much and felt like that was what you wanted to do?
I did not watch The West Wing.
Oh, it wasn't that. What was it then?
It was, this is going to sound insane. It was the 3rd season of MTV's The Real World.
Go on. Not what I was expecting.
I mean, not on its own. I was also an abortion rights activist. And North Dakota, where I grew up, has a single abortion clinic. That is not a popular kind of activist to be in North Dakota. No, the 3rd season of The Real World came out when I was 12 or 13, and it was the one with Pedro Zamora.
Okay, vaguely remembering. Yeah.
Yeah, and like, it was before I had ever met a queer person that I knew of, and before I had a sense that AIDS was something that required activism. And it was, I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, somebody has to do something about this. But also, like, my family's pretty steeped in like Midwestern Democratic politics. So I have this impulse towards social movements and this connection to
small town democracy kind of projects.
Yeah. So it seemed obvious, and then I wrote a lot in college about the like appearance politics of American politics. So the sense in which like women politicians are in a double bind about their looks and their politics and their everything, and it sounded very unpleasant. I kind of was like, oh God, if I go into politics, I'm going to be on a diet forever, which is like death to me. Yeah. And at the same time, I was discovering that there were parts of political science that like didn't have answers to things that I wanted answers to. So it was a good, I think it's a good combination of things. And then I also am a math person, and I sort of discovered quantitative social science. It's like, ooh,
Yeah.
I can do so much.
That's good. Thank you for indulging me a little bit in that, because
Yeah.
I think it's always relevant to hear a little bit about what has drawn people to what they do, and it also makes sense and sets the tone a little bit for who you are to talk about some of these things, because clearly you're somebody who had that bug your whole life. It sounds like, we're gonna make the world better. How do we do it? Let's figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, like, I can point my favorite incident is actually back to elementary school. I got really mad about being forced to sit in a particular order in the lunchroom, and actually made myself little buttons that were like listen to kids.
Free lunch
So
seating for all.
real belief in the power of the people.
That's awesome.
For better and for worse.
So speaking of the power of the people, for better and for worse, what happened last week?
What didn't?
But yeah, my more focused question, I guess, the thing I'm most curious to hear you talk about with your global perspective, with the things that you've studied, and knowing that for me, like, I'm scrolling Twitter, I'm personally taking in a lot of progressive or liberal media sources, and I'm wondering how much is hype and how much is kind of authentic. I should be concerned about our democracy. So from your perspective, as somebody who actually studies authoritarian governments in other parts of the world, how close do you think we were to the collapse of democracy in America last week?
Well, I think, okay, so I'm going to preface this by saying it's super contingent. And I guess, sorry, political science jargon. But, it's very unprecedented. Democratic decline, especially democratic collapse, is so rare that we have a hard time understanding, like, what the causal process actually is. However, a thing that I said about a month ago, and that I keep I keep coming up against again, is that in the literature, a common minimal definition of democracy, like the very lowest bar, is that elections are free and fair, and after they happen, the loser steps down. And there's an orderly transfer of power. In fact, for ages, there were countries in which it was difficult to tell whether, I mean, one country in particular, Botswana, for like 20 years was missing from the data sets because the elections looked free and fair to outside observers, but a single party had remained in power for the entirety of Botswana's post-colonial career. And so, because there hadn't been a loss, there hadn't been an opportunity for a peaceful transfer of power.
They technically didn't meet the definition.
It was missing data. Right. But I think, I think that is really, I mean, I have so many, like, kind of swirling competing thoughts about this. Like, there are several relevant literatures. But I think one of the most worrisome things to me is this dynamic wherein people who are going to face consequences of whatever sort after leaving power will do a lot to remain in power. And we typically think of that as like a banana republic kind of thing, or like something that happens somewhere else.
And the consequences being like The Hague or something, right? Like big global consequences, or yeah.
I mean, frankly, The Hague is a much nicer place to be in prison than the United States or most other countries. And in fact, there have certainly been people who stepped out of their authoritarian positions expressly so that they could go be safe in the Netherlands.
Huh.
Yeah, yeah. It's being imprisoned is bad, full stop, and also sometimes it's better than the alternative. But there are a whole, so I think Americans are used to thinking about life after politics as like, or life after presidential politics as like super great, right? You're going to get invitations to speak. You're going to make $1 jillion on your autobiography. There's going to be consulting money. Everybody's going to respect you.
You get a library.
Right. All of this. And I think that I think looking at the evidence that we have, Donald Trump's position is different than that. Um, I was one of the people who were honking car horns and beating on pots and pans and screaming on Saturday. That's not a typical reaction to, that's not a typical citywide reaction to one's candidate winning.
Yeah.
And it despite the fact that I took my first full inhale in weeks, I was not, it was a scary feeling too. And it remains a scary feeling, and it is particularly a scary feeling when we see other people who have tied their fortunes to the leader because they now have every incentive to do anything they need to do to keep the leader in power. And I will add that I think it's particularly difficult, troubling in a situation where the leader is a populist, a sort of, this is going to sound funny because many of us would characterize Donald Trump as like extremely right wing in an ideological way, but he's not a particularly ideological president. He seems to be the kind of president who experiments with saying whatever, right? Whose work is to activate a base, based on whatever. So we've got lots of different dynamics from comparative politics that we never expected to see in the United States. This question of orderly transition being the kind of first and foremost, but also we are starting to see things that the literature would identify as so-called pro-government militias, or pro-regime militias. It's, there are many other sort of places you could go with that. But I think, so Max Fisher, who is one of the main analysts for The Upshot in the New York Times, tweeted today, and I agree, that he's never seen a wider gap between political scientists and non-political scientists on his Twitter feed. And the reason for that is that political scientists are very, very nervous right now. I think most of us don't think that this is over for a while, both because of the what if he doesn't leave question and because of the what if there is political violence of some sort question. And on a longer time scale, just to make things even more fun, it is really hard to repair political polarization. It is, and it's, it's difficult work. Nobody gets quite what they want. And our political polarization is sort of fundamentally premised on the idea that some people should be treated as less human than others, in my opinion. I think race is at the bottom of our polarization crisis. Um, and that type of polarization is really hard to move past as any, there are plenty of countries that have had ethnic divisions like ours and have ended up in, wide scale systematic violence. I doubt that will happen in the US because we're, relatively speaking, rich. Um, so for most people, political violence isn't worth it.
Right.
But even without violence, there's this sort of undercurrent of deep distrust and hatred that is really not characteristic of a healthy democracy, in my opinion.
It's interesting that you bring up polarization because it's something that I think the average person has added to their vocabulary in the last few years, and it's something I hear people worry a lot about, especially in our congregation, where our faith tells us that all people are beloved, and it's hard to square that sometimes with people's actions. That's always been a problem, but now there's sort of this national conversation of kind of this feeling where some people have expressed it to me as it seems like we have to say you're for us, or you have to pick a side, you have to be for us or you're against us, or the opposite, and people really wrestle with what they label, I think, as polarization. But I also think we don't quite understand how it happens or why it happens. It just seems like it happened and nobody knows. Like, we're just looking around one day, like, how did we become so polarized? I feel like you actually, the research actually talks a little bit about, like, how does that happen or why does it happen?
Yeah, I mean, polarization is like fascinating. And I should start by saying that there's polarization on a bunch of different dimensions. So like often, okay, first, back to comparative politics, a two-party system is actually not, it feels really polarizing at a moment like this. It's not necessarily the most polarizing system because a multi-party system creates more opportunities for things like single issue parties, extremist parties, etc. So, the fact that we don't have exactly an explicitly white supremacist party operating on the national stage that's because of our two-party system, and our two-party system is because of our single member electoral districts. I am not going to bore anybody with that lecture, but it's one of my favorite lectures.
So having more parties wouldn't actually necessarily solve polarization because it might give kind of fringe parties the opportunity to coalesce.
Yeah. So we see, that at almost any place that has a sort of reasonably proportional legislative system. So that's a lot of Scandinavia, that's Germany, although Germany's system is somewhat balanced by other factors. Israel has super, way, incredibly broad representation. So incredibly broad representation of white Israeli Jews, I should say, or Ashkenazi Jews. The question of Jewish identity and whiteness is way not in my wheelhouse. I will not be taking questions
beyond the scope of this discussion.
Yes. Though, right, like I say that, and of course, it in the U.S. comes back to race. So, I think one of the things that we see polarization and populism kind of going together. And historically, both of those things tend to show up also with economic inequality. So rising economic inequality, rising polarization, the rise of populist parties and sort of individual demagogues. And I think that is, there are a lot of different explanations for that. It is one of the things we know is that most people are not ideological. Populism is appealing because it's like a club. And it's a club that says, I mean, it defines the people in a very particular way so that some people are ruled in and some people are ruled out. And that does the work of polarization very neatly. It also undermines democracy, right? The sort of foundational belief in a democracy is that we're going to fight again. Like, I might really hate your politics, but I know that, I won this time, but next time you could win. And that's okay. Or at least that is, an outcome that I could live with. And so that's loyal opposition. And when that goes away, when we start talking about political foes as treasonous or necessarily criminals or necessarily evil, then that is that is a bad thing.
It's escalating, certainly, the polarization.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly that's you can have intense polarization in a perfectly healthy democracy. What you can't have is the erosion of the idea of the loyal opposition, the erosion of the idea that opposition is legitimate, right? Because without opposition of some sort, that's like basic. That's like the peaceful transfer of power. It's one of these things that is like, you can't really do democracy without it.
Do you think, it's hard for me even to remember back before years ago, but when I look back at kind of how I see the rise of polarization in recent history, I feel like not even Republicans, specifically Donald Trump's tactics was a lot of that escalation, and a lot of that ramping up happened because of the rhetoric he used and the tactics he used to win the first election. And since then, do you think there are seeds that were laid before him, or was there polarization happening before these last 4 years that prepared the way for this place? Yeah.
I think there's a bunch of historical precedent. There's Reconstruction, there's the Dixiecrat era, there's sort of the Gilded Age. These are all times when you see the three things I mentioned earlier: increasing polarization, populism, economic inequality. And I think, I as much as I'm like glad on a sort of personal safety level that George W. Bush, has congratulated Biden on his win and sort of, used his position. I think there are plentiful seeds in sort of Republican strategy going back many years of what's going on right now. So, it's not at all an accident that the Republican Party has become anti-Black, or has, roughly speaking, become anti-Black, right? That was, that was the Southern strategy, going back to Nixon and Nixon and before, but certainly starting clearly with Nixon. And I think that when you associate a particular set of Americans with criminality, with dependency, with poverty, like when you make those rhetorical moves, even if you're not making them overtly, you're setting people up to believe just wild and crazy things, particularly the large chunk of, like Trump country in a lot of places is not very integrated. So like, there are 0 African Americans in many of the counties of my home state of North Dakota that went way, 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 way red. And that makes it easier, not harder, to believe, crazy things about what's going on in the cities.
Right.
So I think, the rhetoric, the kind of thinly veiled, coded rhetoric of the last many years, and by the way, it's not just a Republican phenomenon, right? Hillary Clinton said the famous phrase super predators. Joe Biden was in on it too. It's not as if one party has like been super awesome for Black Americans. But I think that anytime a party, and this is again more comparative politics, parties that have the opportunity to use ethnic appeals often will. It's a very effective tool
to help win
And the
elections, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a deeply unethical but really interesting experiment by a political scientist named Leonard Wanchicon, who actually experimentally manipulated the presidential election in Benin, which is his home country. Yeah, I know, that face. But what he wanted to know was, if I sort of randomly assign my friends, the presidential candidates, we can set that dynamic aside for a minute, but all the presidential candidates are people that I basically know, because it's an unequal society. If I randomly assign them to give a sort of broad social welfare speech versus I'm going to help you out in this tribe speech, which will be more effective? And the answer is the tribal one.
Yeah.
Because humans are, because humans are a problem, because, our brains work that way, and we are susceptible. And we're all susceptible. It's not like it's the special province of people who are uneducated, or the special province of white people. It just happens that in this country, that has become an effective cleavage. But there's a bunch of there's great political science utilizing the more or less random boundaries between different post-colonial countries. Turns out one side of the border you can have, violent ethnic conflict. The other side of the border, nobody even recognizes the difference between two tribes. And that's because of the electoral incentives of the people in power.
And whether or not they take advantage of those differences to win.
Yep. So how do you slice people up? And how does it benefit you?
I feel very vindicated right now, because I feel like I've been saying a lot watching all this, that leadership makes such a difference, and the things that people in power do has a trickle-down effect into how we treat each other and how we see each other and talk about each other. So now I feel like the research is backing me up. And I also feel like I'm very worried for my job security as someone who tries to literally preach against tribalism, that's not maybe a winning strategy for human nature.
I think the best instance of tribalism is class conflict. So let's all just concentrate on that division, and we can put our I by the way, I don't actually think we should eat the rich, particularly because I myself am an upper middle class person. But I do think, right, that the communists are onto something a little bit, which is that, class is malleable, class produces real things in the world. And class, if you play your cards right, can be a unifier. So that was actually, so this is why, by the way, the FBI killed Fred Hampton. This is the Black Panthers were on their way to creating a multiracial, sort of lower class social justice coalition, and it was seen as so threatening that the government actually had him murdered. And that happens all over the place. We're not special.
Yeah. It's
But it is,
it's definitely a popular notion about why Dr. King was killed at the time that he was killed, that he was turning his attention to
yes.
both anti-war activism and economic justice. Yeah.
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 Yeah. And you see it in the sort of explicit policies of sort of Southern white Democrats from Reconstruction through the 60s, that like a way to keep poor white Southerners in line, and keep them bought into the system that is making rich white Southerners very rich at their expense, is to demonize and oppress, right? Is Jim Crow. And again, like from a comparative perspective, while the US is like unique or nearly unique in its combination of settler colonialism and chattel slavery and democracy, right? That's an unusual combination.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that dynamic is everywhere, the sort of ethnic politics dynamic. And I think for me, it really, just as you have been saying, for me, the implication is that it's fragile, that what we have here is fragile, and that it, requires nurture.
Yeah.
And it's not self-sustaining. A bad actor can mess things up in the United States, just like a bad actor can mess things up in, Central African Republic or Greece or Hungary, as in the case of Viktor Orban.
Yeah.
So.
And when the bad actor is the president and has a lot of media attention constantly, that amplifies the bad actions that they can do to undermine democracy. And also I hear in what you're saying that a common thread in times throughout our history when democracy has been threatened, there's also been substantial economic inequality. And that became another thing that people could manipulate. That I will say people could manipulate, but also that was a genuinely felt thing that many people were looking around and saying, why don't I have access to the basic needs that I have to live?
Yeah.
Which on one level, I don't want to say you can't blame them, but you can understand how someone would sympathize with someone who then wants to manipulate that message to say, I can get you what you need. So whether or not they ever follow through on that. We have talked for almost a full hour because this is fascinating. We could probably talk a longer time, and we have some questions. And I want to ask you one more question before we get to the questions that people put in the comments.
Excellent. Yes.
So how close were we to the collapse of American democracy last week? It sounds like not close. And it sounds like the fact that that Joe Biden won our elections helps. But the fact that President Trump is not conceding and that there is still some question about peaceful transfer of power means that there are probably still things we need to be on the lookout for. What would you say that the average person can do at this point to protect these democratic norms in our country?
I think if we see, it's really hard. I think that we need to be pushing elected officials of both parties to speak up. So that's calling and writing and things like that, particularly if you are, a sort of, say you're a Trump voter who is more interested in the kind of progress of American democracy than in Trump per se. I think, and those people are out there, right? There are plenty of people who voted for Trump because they identify as Republicans and they could never vote for a Democrat. Those people are going to need to sort of do the George W. Bush thing and step up. For those of us who don't have Republicans to write to or don't have that sort of particular role, I think, the count every vote protests turned into parties pretty fast. But if there are, the one thing that we know from literature is that mass action can work, especially in moments of particular crisis. So I think, you know, you may not ever have been in the street before, but if there's a moment when when there is sort of steadfast refusal, or if there is a crisis point where, say, the Supreme Court attempts to step in a way that is clearly illegitimate, that's going to be a moment for everybody to stop what they're doing and like go do something. It's hard. It's really like we are so used to not working those levers of power because we're so used to, again, the sort of norm that things are going to proceed
smoothly.
Yeah. And when they don't, I think we need to be ready. So find out about protest safety. It's going to be my main suggestion.
Are there suggestions for, obviously one suggestion is showing up and being there.
Yeah.
Donating money to support protest organizations.
Yep. Bail funds are always, bail funds are the correct way to give your money even when there's not mass protest, but it's especially important in the face of mass protest. It's very difficult because I would have said 4 years ago, donate to media that are doing this work. And it is unclear to me whether media are effectively doing this work because the audiences have become so divided. Yeah. And that's a scary thing to me, right? That not even like Fox News. Everybody knows what Fox News is, and Fox News seems to be, roughly speaking, breaking with the Trump administration.
I actually turned on Fox News for like a full 45 minutes on Saturday because I was so curious to see if they would be buying his line or Democracy's line, basically. And I was pleasantly surprised to see them reporting basically the same thing that the other networks were reporting. So
yeah. I think what a lot of people don't know is that local news is no longer local news in a lot of places, and that is something that is truly terrifying to me. Because it looks like local news, it sounds like local news. It's the same reporter, but they are delivering, in many cases, news that has been sort of prepackaged at large conservative conglomerates. So, and local news is still a really, really important way that Americans get their information. So I think supporting real, actual local news, supporting a local newspaper that is an independent newspaper, is a long-term strategy that's for the good.
That's great. And the role of like speaking up just to like within your own personal networks, naming what is normal and what is not normal and what should be happening, what shouldn't be happening still matters, would you say?
Absolutely. I think, you've got to hold the line on what's real and what's not. And that includes sort of, self-reflection. I am very, very worried about kind of court packing schemes that are coming from the left. Not because I think that it wouldn't work, but because it sort of, like, if court packing is what ultimately saves democracy or protects Black and brown Americans from a sort of outpouring of state violence, I think it's going to have to happen. However, it's not a great cycle to be in. And so I think,
because when the party power changes, it could just continue and there's not an end in sight. Yeah.
There's no end in sight, and it's very like tit for tat, one thing after the other. So, after court packing, it'll be, some sort of bizarre expansion of the Senate or, and I think it's worth having that in mind, even if you think that it's a necessary exigency at this moment, to know that, like, it must be a real crisis because this is not okay. And I want to pitch an organization that I'm really excited about, which is called Bright Line Watch, run by fellow Swati Brendan Nyhan,
Nice.
who's now a political scientist at Dartmouth. And Bright Line Watch has done quarterly surveys of both political scientists and average Americans, asking for a selection of events that happened in the quarter. How unusual is it, and how important is it, and how abnormal is it?
Huh.
Yeah, and you can see sort of political scientists as experts holding the line a little bit, with sort of comparative knowledge, but you can see the public opinion like drifting around following Trump or following the politics of the moment. And I think understanding that that is happening is really key when we're talking to our friends and neighbors.
That sounds fascinating. Is that, you can just Google that, Bright Line Watch?
I think it's a .org at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have quarterly reports, they have cool graphs, and it's I think it's a smart response that sort of does what academics do, sort of for the good of the public.
Yeah. Do you have 8 more minutes, I would say, maybe, and we could go till 12:40, and I'll just ask you these 2 questions that came in?
Absolutely.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Let me see.
I could talk forever.
I mean,
for better and for worse.
It is fascinating to talk with you about this for all the reasons I said at the beginning, because your perspective is not the perspective of most people.
That is, by the way, that is a thing that political scientists are really needing to grapple with and not that great at grappling with. Right? Turns out most people are not experts.
Yeah.
And our sort of models of politics are really bad at taking that into consideration.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. As a psychology undergrad major, yes, I agree. We are bad at at remembering the things that are not reinforced all the time. That's for sure.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So
uncertainty is the worst.
So one of my congregants asked, when we were talking back about polarization, I remember you saying something about how polarization is really hard to repair. Susan asked, do you think the pandemic might help us repair political polarization?
I can see how that would work. And I'm not talking from my expertise at this point. I can kind of understand it. I think one of the things that's interesting, like I've been thinking a lot recently about truth commission processes. Truth commissions don't just happen in the wake of like a genocide. They happen in the wake of many transitions to democracy after authoritarianism or other kind of big societal upsets. And they happen to a smaller degree in American institutions. So, the Brown University report on its relationship with slavery was effectively the work of a truth commission.
Yeah.
And I think it is hard to get to real reconciliation without coming to some sort of understanding, like collective understanding of the facts. It is also hard to do reconciliation until, like, a lot of reconciliation processes happen and work after things have really been burned to the ground. We want to avoid that, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think in that sense, the kind of magnitude of the disaster of the coronavirus, I think we need public mourning in a way that hasn't happened yet and probably can't happen until after this political crisis is a little bit more resolved. But I do think, often, right? That's if we're at war against the coronavirus, maybe we are a little bit more united in and of ourselves.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting question, though.
I think it's again, I'm also not speaking from expertise, just my opinion, but I think it could present an opportunity. It was one of the most heartbreaking things about watching the last, God, almost 9 months now unfold, was the opportunity that the pandemic presented for us to unite against a common enemy that's actually not even a human enemy, right? We don't need to dehumanize anyone to fight a pandemic. And it could have been such a unifying force, and instead it was explicitly used to create a new division. The first day that I watched a live feed of a protest against, mask wearing in Harrisburg was like the hardest day of this pandemic for me, because I was just like, oh, this is what we're doing with this.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and I was saying, so I gave a talk the other day, and a thing that I have noticed in my neighborhood, so I'm in West Philly, and I am out at Black Lives Matter protests when I can be. And it is so interesting to see the ways in which our current politics have layered things on to one another. One of the things that you notice when you're out at a protest is that all protesters are wearing masks and 0 police officers are wearing masks. In fact, police officers, if you ask them to wear a mask, often turn sort of overtly hostile. And to me, that's like such a telling symbol of the way that COVID has been politicized and the way that the politicization of COVID is sort of layered over the kind of general lack of concern for human life that our police in West Philly have seemed to show.
Yeah. Well, if there is anything good to say, which there really isn't, but if there's anything good to say about the fact that the pandemic hasn't ended, maybe it's that the fact that the pandemic hasn't ended means that new leadership can change the dynamic around the pandemic. And yeah, that's a great question, Susan. Thanks.
Yeah.
The other question was from my high school English teacher. And she said, excited for this topic about an educator dealing with politics. She says she's also trying to build a supportive, so she teaches high school in suburban Philly. She says trying to build a supportive class environment, and as a member of the school where she works, equity task force. She says, any ideas for respecting all from where they are to where we would like to be collectively? That's maybe more with your DEI hat on too.
It's so hard.
Yeah.
And I just remind me of your teacher's name.
Laura,
I just want to say thank you. High school teachers have it so hard right now, because this is so hard to teach around. The thing that has worked for me in the past is setting a very unusual sort of ground rule in my class, where when we're talking about politics, people are invited to share with a sort of semi-flexible time limit. They're invited to share how X, Y, or Z political situation affects them personally. The rule is that there is no crosstalk, and that there's no direct response. However, if the person's contribution relies on factual claims about what is actually going on in the world, I feel obligated to talk about what the best evidence says. And so for me, that keeping the focus on people's experiences while doing some adjudication of the facts is really key. But I struggle every time with the sort of, there's a lot of white fragility that comes up in response to kind of rage by my Black and brown students, and there's a lot of anger and sadness and fear that shows up when, a Trump supporter student says, discusses how attacked or targeted they feel. And then I like to try and take a step back and talk about who has what are the society-wide patterns that we're pointing to? What is the difference between the society-wide pattern and the kind of social dynamics that you might be feeling? But
So
it is.
asking people to start from personal experiences, and it sounds like part of seeing your role as an educator also then pulling out their perspective a little bit and sharing a little bit of, which also hopefully listening to each other helps with pulling out their perspective a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah, if you can't, and if I've had people leave, leave in the middle of class, that's fine. If you don't want to listen to something that somebody says because it is too intense for you, that's your choice. I think one of the things that is it's just dogging us right now as college educators, but I think probably even more so for high school educators, is we have less FaceTime than we've ever had, or more FaceTime, less actual FaceTime. Yeah. We have more content in some ways, especially those of us who teach kind of humanities or social sciences, and there's not enough time in the world to get through everybody's feelings. So balancing that against you must actually memorize the 3 major electoral systems.
Right.
It's so hard.
Yeah, I imagine.
Yeah. But listen to people's feelings and respond, and validate their feelings, but respond if their facts are wrong, is the only thing that I have seen that works even a little bit for me.
Well, I'm grateful that you're doing that in your classrooms. I wish there were more places in the world where that was the norm, because it's reminiscent actually of something that we do at WellSprings. One of our foundational kind of guidelines for any small group we lead is speaking from the I, and just reminding people that instead of talking about other people and instead of generalizing, even actually instead of doing something that people do a lot when they talk about how they feel, they will say you know how when you're stressed out and you just wish that your kids would go somewhere else for a little while. Yeah, we do that all the time, and we talk a lot about how getting more comfortable speaking from our own experience is healing for us, and it's also a more responsible way to engage with the world and with each other. And helps, actually, I think the practice of speaking from our own experience helps, or at least makes it easier for us to listen when someone else is doing the same, even if we don't like what they're saying.
Yep. Yeah. I think the, AA is onto something with the no crosstalk rule.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Amelia, you're the best. You're a gem.
Aw, you're the best, Reverend Lee.
Aw. Professor, do you go by Dr. Hoover Green or Dr. Green?
I go by Amelia. I know I'm not supposed to. It's really hard Professor Hoover Green is such a mouthful.
It is. You could go PhD.
Yeah, AHG, PhD. It'll work.
I really appreciate you taking more than an hour out of your day to talk, and this has been really fascinating. We could talk for another hour. We'll see.
Oh yeah.
Knock on wood. Hopefully democracy's okay. If not, maybe we'll do this again in January.
Yeah, man. I'm here for it. And if people want reading lists, boy, have I got them.
Well, when this lives on my Facebook page for the next couple days, sometimes people will type additional questions and things in the comments, and I think because you're tagged, you'll see them. So if you have time, feel free to chime in, and I really
I will.
Cool.
I really appreciate the invitation. Yeah. All right. You're a delight. Thank you. Thanks for the questions, everybody.
Yeah. Bye, Amelia. Have a good day. Bye, everybody.
Bye. You too.